Welcome to Chapter 3 of the jf010e transmission. In this chapter we will cover the mechanical specifications, clearance and adjustments of the unit. My name is Jared Warren, and I will be your host for this course. It's a great day to fix transmissions, so let's get started. Torque specifications. First of all, there's very little information, as a lot of us know, on the Jatco, any of the Jatco CVTs for that matter, but the jf010e. Very little published information. So let's kind of go over some of the torque specifications that we've come up with. We have done this through working on these transmissions and through bolt sizes. So kind of keep that into considerations. There's a bearing retainer in the front case. It holds bearing in. We're going to say that's 90 inch-pounds. Case half, so the front main case half to the main case of the transmissions. It's 40 foot-pounds of torque and 14 millimeter size socket. Drain plug, 30 foot-pounds, 10 millimeter Allen. This is in the pan of the transmission. Filter to the valve body, 90 inch-pounds, 10 millimeter bolts. The flow control valve, or the flow valve plug, 30 foot-pounds of torque, 10 millimeter Allen. Lube tube, just a couple small little 10 millimeter bolts, 90 inch-pounds. Manual shaft and manual shaft number 2. As you see the number 19 size socket. Nut goes on first, and we got that at 12 foot-pounds of torque, and then the lock nut is 12 foot-pounds of torque also. Pan bolts were at 90 inch-pounds. Primary nut, it's a 46 millimeter nut. We're at 180 foot-pounds of torque. Primary retainer, that's the retaining bolts through the rear cover that hold the primary pulley in. We're at 20 foot-pounds of torque there, 12 millimeter bolts. These ones actually have washers on them too, or rubber O-rings. Talk about that a little bit later. So the pump to case and the pump half are both at 20 foot-pounds of torque. Pump half bolts are 6 millimeter Allens. These are extra soft bolts, so when removing them, requires like an impact socket or impact driver, or you will strip them out. Heat is also a good thing on those bolts because they have like a thread locker on them. The rear cover of the case bolts, 14 millimeter socket, 40 foot-pounds of torque. The secondary pulley nut is 200 foot-pounds. This is a large nut, 50 millimeters. Secondary retaining bolts is the ones with little O-rings on them, coming into the rear cover again, 20 foot-pounds. And valve body to case bolts are 90 inch-pounds. Some specialty tools. This is kind of one of the first questions that always come up when working on CVTs. We don't have the tools, those kind of thing. What I have found best personally is this Posi-Lock TJ1 puller. This puller locks onto the pulley real good. Don't have to worry about it popping off. It works on all the Jatco CVTs that I've done, and many of the other ones also. The only time this puller has not worked for me is on the Subaru Generation 2. I'm sure there's probably some others out there too, but this is a very good universal puller that works on many CVTs. Whatever it takes, and Transtar both are stocking this puller now for the CVTs. For you guys, the other thing, you can find them on Amazon, eBay. I've seen them on eBay for like $160, $180. So it's kind of a little expensive puller, but again, it will go a long ways through all these CVTs, and I've had mine for 15 years and has not broke yet. It's a very good puller. Couple other options you do have. Transco makes a puller band that works with your T-bar puller. Basically, it's a band that wraps around the pulley, and you bolt it to the pulley. Then it has some all thread, and you can bring that up to your T-bar puller that you already have and use that puller to relieve the tension and pull these pulleys apart. Adaptacase also has their version of this too. It looks like a very well-made tool, along with Transco and the adapter case are both made in the United States, so that's always a good thing. Then we do have cvtpushbelt.com. It's made overseas. I forget where. I think it's the Netherlands. I could be, or New Zealand. I'm sorry, I forget where they're located. But CVT Push Belt has this kit up here, which these two bands wrap around the pulley itself, and then you use this puller to take the tension off the pulley, and also to pull the puller apart. These two pieces here are for installing the reverse spring retainer, which would be very handy. I do them without the tool to compress the spring retainer by just walking the snap ring around, pushing on it with 2 screwdrivers that we usually do a lot of times when we're transmission builders. But this tool would make it a lot easier and probably quicker. So you may want to give them a check on the internet to see what they have. I know they have quite a few different tool kits for quite a few different CVTs, so it's definitely worth it to check them out. Some large sockets you're going to need. Most of us have like 32 millimeter, but 46 millimeter. This 50 millimeter needs to be a deep socket, and the 55 millimeter. Don't get me wrong, I love my tool truck, but these large sockets, they are very proud of them on the tool truck. So I personally got some off at Amazon, and saved roughly $300 just by buying these impact sockets off of Amazon. They were all 3/4 inch drive, and I had to reduce it down to 1/2 inch. But to me, quite a bit of savings over the tool truck. So you may want to check your local tool stores too for some of these metric sockets before you get this transmission in. Gear ratios, we kind of went over this a little bit earlier on the other chapter, but let's go over it again. You want to use the last 5 numbers of the case number, which is on the top of the case, embedded or engraved into the case itself. You use these numbers to see which unit your car came out of, or what unit came out of what car. You can also tell if it's 2-wheel drive or all-wheel drive, what size motor, and most importantly, your reverse ratio and your final drive ratio. As you see here, you have a couple different reverse ratios, 1.75 and 1.766. And then you have a final drive ratio that's different also, 5.173 to 4.878. So we need to pay attention to our case numbers and our ratios and make sure we get the right transmission in the right car, not just swapping a bunch of used transmissions around, coming up with some ratio codes and stuff. There's no printed information on clutch clearances. This information is what I have came across with building a few of these units, taking some notes, and seeing where the clutch clearance falls within. First of all, I'm going to go backwards here. The forward clutch clearance, 40 to 60 thousandths. I normally see 48 thousandths is what I have written down. What I have seen on most of the units that I have built. I like doing this just by basically dial indicator and see how much the pressure plate moves. I'm not air checking the clutch pack or anything like that. It's not piston travel. It's just basically the clearance in between the snap ring here and the pressure plate, and it's roughly 48 thousandths on the forward clutch. Reverse brake. Over here in the case, do the same thing. Dial indicator, micrometer, fuel air gauge. You're measuring the clearance in between the top snap ring and top pressure plate. This one can be a little bit looser. I've seen some of these around 58, 57 thousandths. Personally, it wouldn't scare me to be even a little bit higher than that. But we came up with 40 to 60 thousandths. We did see some down in the low 40s. So that's where we come up with this number. One thing about these clutches in the CVTs, me personally, I don't change them very often. So if you have a clutch clearance issue, you may want to check the size of your replacement clutches if you're replacing the clutches in the seals. But me personally, I have changed very few clutches in the CVTs because usually they are just fine because they stay on once they're on. So once you put it in forward gear, your forward clutch is on, and it stays on until you put it back into park. So there's very little wear on these clutches. One note about that, I do reuse the clutches a lot of times, but pistons, you need to make sure you change these pistons. Don't try to shortcut the pistons. We'll cover this in the rebuild section also. Alright, unit end play. Again, no dealer information, no factory information, so this is what we've come up with. First of all, we build the transmission up, and then without the pump, set our H gauge to the bearing. So the bearing here in the H gauge, we set this to 0. We flip our H gauge over, and we put it on the pump. And we're measuring the distance between this rod right here and the aluminum housing. This one had 25 thousandths, and that seems to be normal. There is no shim or thrush washer in this unit. You just have 4 thrust bearings, so I don't think this unit is adjustable. Do not have any part numbers for any thicker bearings or anything along those lines. So if you have an end play issue, you're going to have to check the parts that you got to make sure that there are the correct ones if you replaced anything. And then number 2 is something misstacked or a thrust washer turned upside down, something along those lines. Differential and transfer shaft end play, more like preload. So go ahead and put your differential into the main case and put the front case on, put a few bolts in it, and reach in through the pump area right here is your ring gear. Check your end play, make sure you have less than 0 end play, so you're going to have 0 end play here, and this gear should rotate about 20 inch-pounds of force to get it to rotate. You could rig up a way of checking your the drag on the differential or the preload if you did something through the spider gear and latched onto the pin itself. But this ring gear turns real easy. It shouldn't have a lot of preload, but it definitely should not have any end play on the differential itself. Take it back apart, pull out your differential and put in your transfer gear. Bolt your front case half back on. Flip the case over, and this is looking from the rear of the transmission. And you can see your transfer gear in there. Make sure you have 0 end play. And then your drag on this one was about 20 inch-pounds to get it rotating too. So I haven't seen a big issue here. We do see some bearing issues, that's for sure. So you always will want to definitely check and make sure your preload is not too tight. Sometimes they screw this up from the factory from the get-go. That's why the bearings failed. If you replace any bearings, most definitely want to check this. If you have one that's too tight or too loose, the shims are in the main case underneath the bearing races themselves. We'll get to that in our rebuild section. Again, do not use the wrong transmission fluid. We've seen issues with when the incorrect fluid is used. Only use the Nissan CVT fluid, NS2. We're going to use roughly 10.6 quarts of fluid on the overhaul. Transfer case takes the GL5 fluid, 80W90, 0.625 quarts, so a little over a half quart. Transmission pressures and specifications and return lines. So let's hit the return lines first. Return line coming out of the cooler going back into the transmission is the rear one. The oil going to the cooler is the front one. Now let's talk about pressures a little bit. First of all, we need to take caution. High pressure, this transmission can make over 800 psi. We need a gauge and a hose that is rated at 1000 psi or more. Me personally, I would recommend investing in some transducers. It's a lot safer. These basically screw right into the case or a fitting, and then the transducer itself wired into your scan tool, or you can read them off a multimeter. But a lot safer to measure transmission pressures with this higher pressure. So what we find normal is line pressure at an idle is 108 psi roughly. Line pressure at a stall is 826 psi. Line pressure tap is here right by the cooler line. We also have available for use the forward clutch pressure tap. Primary pressure tap over here by the case connector. And then on the rear cover you have your secondary pressure. This will conclude our chapter on manufacturing specifications for the jf010e Jatco CVT transmission. We want to thank you for participating in our virtual training solutions powered by ATRA. Until next time, let's keep fixing transmissions together.